that geopolitics is truly unsentimental, right? So you can be on paper a superpower one day and be written down to zero and be a failed state the next day, right? That's the reality of geopolitics. So no country, not India, not America, should ever, or China, should drink too much of its own Kool-Aid when it comes to geopolitics.
So as the world moves into the age of intelligence, can we afford to have that asymmetric power amongst a few? Our belief is clearly not, because it's going to lead to complete disruption and chaos. So that's when we came up with the idea of creating the intelligence grid as a parallel to the electricity grid and building that out for adoption and diffusion around the world.
So to give us a different perspective on this particular moment, the hinge moment in many ways when the old order, the old liberal order is in decline, and there are many new forces at play, we have two fantastic speakers who are again in the center of this phenomenon. First is Parag Khanna, who is known globally as a geostrategist, independent thinker, and is someone who advises both Fortune 500 companies and countries. And Faheem Ahamed, who's the chief marketing officer of G42, one of the most powerful AI companies in the UAE, which is at the center of UAE's transformation as a technological and intellectual center. It's part of the reinvention of UAE as a kind of global hub. And what is the thinking that's driving these transformation at a national level? To go into these conversations, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Parag Khanna and Faheem Ahamed. Parag, the professor used a phrase which is a great entry point into your many theses on the world as well. He said, no one really knows what economic security means in this world. You know, you have a perspective which says this whole obsession with the US-China binary and the great power competition is a bit of a red herring, and that the world in actual terms is that there are much better lenses through which to understand the world, one of which is a kind of geo-economic interpretation of it. So tell us about that. You know.
Sure. Well, first, let me thank you for having us all here. Here's my first thesis, which is irrefutable. You are India's most clairvoyant curator of events. This has been an incredible experience. And I think we also appreciate your stamina. You're the marathon moderator, too, which is really going the extra mile. So thank you so much. This has been a fantastic weekend. Yes, I do believe that having a rigid, I would caricature it as the accounting approach to geopolitics, where you say, let me stack up and quantify as much as possible. This is how geopolitics was done in the mid-20th century. How many warships do you have? What's your GDP? What's your territorial size? What's your population? And then you just stack them up. But don't forget the geo in geopolitics, right? The geography matters. Ultimately, your influence, your effective power in the world is a function of many relational conditions. You know, Chinese power is greater in Asia than it is in, say, Latin America. The United States can go into Venezuela, for example, and oust and rescind Chinese interests there overnight if it wants to. China can do the same in Asia to certain American interests already. When or if it chooses to do so varies. But I'll just make a quick global point, which is that the metaphor that I most prefer for evaluating the whole world as a totality today is a theory, an approach that a growing number of scholars use, which is called neo-medievalism, which is a big word. It simply means take the world between the years 500 and 1500 and look at the distribution of power. Really every region of the world that had been discovered and that was part of the system, Holy Roman Empire and various city-states in Europe, Islamic caliphates, India's dynasties, Chinese dynasties and empires, all coexisted and had varying degrees of strong and weak ties. and get used to that distribution of power, which affirms the multipolarity of the world, which is simply a reality that you observe every single day. And don't worry so much as to whether or not it maps onto that accounting approach to geopolitics. And then the final point is that, and they're related ideas, is that geopolitics is truly unsentimental, right? I don't want to give you today or ever or otherwise an Indian view or an American view or a Singaporean view. Geopolitics doesn't care about you or you or you. Geopolitics is evaluating and analyzing this incredibly complex system. You can be on paper a superpower one day and be written down to zero and be a failed state the next day, right? That's the reality of geopolitics. So no country, not India, not America, should ever, or China, should drink too much of its own Kool-Aid when it comes to geopolitics.
That's interesting perspective, and Parag, and definitely, your thesis plays out in this recent face-off with President Trump and pretty much everyone on the globe. Yeah. That he's kind of had a chop and change approach, particularly with China, which is positioned as their greatest adversary. And it was interesting to hear from Professor that China possibly doesn't see America in the same light, but America does. And yet it rolled back because it's implicated in the trade and the supply chains so deeply that it can't really harm China without harming itself, So that part of it plays out. But on your point about politics being a bit of a Kool-Aid and, you thinking you're a superpower or not, on that count, we were also just hearing from the professor that China can't really take its place in the world because on the political front, or in its political sort of savoriness, let's put it, it is not that attractive to the rest of the world, So do you think that your thesis kind of breaks over there?
No, in the mid-2000s, there was a period where people spoke actively about the China model. In fact, the term China model was coined in the mid-2000s, ironically, by an American who was writing about how China was getting, in fact, it was also called the Beijing Consensus, right? That China had bucked the Washington Consensus, that it was obviously heavily regulated capitalism, industrial policy, flexing its muscles through infrastructure networks, and China was sort of doing everything right. Again, what's so dangerous in that thinking is that it's linear in a very non-linear world. So let's take, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. If we were sitting and having this conversation just 10 years ago, and we can all remember 10 years ago, put yourselves in that frame, there was a linear logic saying China is literally going to pave its way over the world and replace America as the sole superpower. What you have found, though, because everything is actually non-linear, is that because people see something like that happening, they resist it happening. Not only the little guys, the developing countries that say, I don't want to be subjected to a debt for equity swap if you're Sri Lanka, you don't want your port to be handed over to China, then other countries see something like that happening and they say, how can I make sure that doesn't happen to me? And so one of the things I've argued is that if you really look at the on-the-ground dynamics, and I spend a lot of time in Central Asia and Middle East and elsewhere, you see that countries are trying to almost overcompensate for this notion that, China is going to take over before it actually even happens, and that prevents it from happening. I'll give you an example from the Western perspective, which is that 10 years ago, you did not have the Pax Silica, which the Indian government joined precisely a day before yesterday. You did not have the resilient supply chain initiative, the technology partnerships, the critical minerals mine to magnet initiative, and about 15 other acronyms that I can't even remember right now to respond to China's Belt and Road. If Belt and Road didn't exist, all of these responses to Belt and Road wouldn't have happened. So if you were making a linear forecast 10 years ago about China taking over the world, you missed everything that responded to it in the last 10 years, which has been, quite frankly, more important than China's Belt and Road. And that's how the world works in this real-time, dynamic, complex system. And to me, I mean when I say this is poetry in motion. This is geopolitical poetry. You have to be very comfortable with this constant dance and not presume that anything is going to be a static, linear, or permanent. And then Because as I said before, the Middle Ages, remember, lasted 1,000 years. So for those who assume that the new equilibrium that you can simply put on a chart and say, aha, we've arrived, it's 2028, 2 years from now, and everything will have stabilized by 2028 and we'll know the hierarchy of the world. I assure you, you will not. It will not be there. We will not have any kind of firm equilibrium that we can identify that will be durable anytime in the coming decades.
Right.
And so when I say new Middle Ages, I mean it very seriously.
Fahim, first, do you agree with these statements that, it's a new medieval ages and that, the world is more intelligently interpreted if you look at it through a geo-economic lens rather than a geopolitical lens? So yeah, first those two, others, I'll end up asking you too many questions.
No, thank you. Completely agree. And within that, I think there's the strong layer of human beings, right? We humans, whether we are policymakers, shapers, and decision makers here in India, back in DC, in UAE or Singapore, we've all become global nomads, and we have more in common with each other across countries than our old friends and people back home. And that has a huge impact on some of this dynamism that is going around as part of globalization, which Parag has mentioned. So completely agree with that.
So let me just bring the focus to the UAE for a moment, that UAE is going through a very, a kind of exponential transformation. It's positioning themselves at the absolute center of this intelligence revolution, One is at the infrastructure level, the other is at a philosophical, political level. So one, talk to us about the UAE vision, because when we were talking about China really transforming very fast over 50 years, one can see that happening with UAE. It's moving from a fossil fuel, tourism-based economy to an intelligence economy. So what are the ingredients of that? What's the thinking that's driving it?
So when we had Sam Altman visit Abu Dhabi a few years ago and saw what was out there, he said this is perhaps the best kept secret on all things AI that the world needs to know. And I think it's important for us to kind of jog back in time, because the world woke up to all things AI on the back of ChatGPT, which was November of 2022.
23, yeah.
In UAE, the current president, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, when he was the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi at the World Government Summit back in 2015, made an interesting statement. He said, in 50 years' time, when we are to ship out that last barrel of oil, are we going to be sad? And he said, if we invest intelligently now, we should be celebrating that last barrel of oil. That was back in 2015. So the shift on knowledge-based economy, and in that the role AI had to play, was front and center of the strategy. It was back in 2017 that we had the AI strategy for UAE. We had the world's first AI minister, who at that time was, I think, 27 years old. So we've been at this for a long, long time, and UAE has been one of the best sandbox to experiment on how to transform and transition an entire nation to becoming AI native. And that's the journey that we've been at. Now, what's interesting is the thesis behind this, right? It's all about enhancing citizen lives, optimizing, and then having a competitive edge and creating resilience for your country, because UAE is a small nation. But the thesis we had was, for AI to thrive, you need velocity. And we as humanity have completely failed on electricity, because 100 years ago it was invented. We still have nearly 30% of the world that don't have power. It's pretty much created the developed, developing, underdeveloped. So as the world moves into the age of intelligence, can we afford to have that asymmetric power amongst a few? our belief is clearly not, because it's going to lead to complete disruption and chaos. So that's when we came up with the idea of creating the intelligence grid as a parallel to the electricity grid and building that out for adoption and diffusion around the world. So this is something that we've been championing for the last 3 years. And the entire focus is on diffusion and adoption rather than the race for the tech and creating real use cases on the ground. Something that we recently launched at the World Economic Forum was a new concept called digital embassies. Not every country will have the capital, will have the power to build this. So do they just stay behind, or they have a lag of
Quickly
5-7 years?
Share with the audience, those who don't know what the digital embassy concept
So the whole
is.
concept of the digital embassy is, in the UAE, we're now building a 5 gigawatt AI capacity. The first one is the 1 gigawatt, which is Stargate UAE. We're now making that available to countries, all the friendly countries around this region, to use it for their fundamental research, their use cases, with complete sovereignty. And the sovereignty controls will be with the reciprocating country.
So, I want to just ask you one question before pulling Parag back into it, which was that UAE, there are two perspectives on this. Someone told me, I'm really impressed with the UAE, that even while it's doing business with America, is keeping its doors open to China. But there are other perspectives which says that to get the Microsoft deal, to get the big partnership that's really driving Stargate, that you've actually started to recede from China in critical ways, which then goes against Parag's thesis. So which do you think is a more accurate version of what UAE is doing?
Well, I was involved in that entire journey,
Yes.
so I could give you a timestamp on this. We had to make a strategic decision on the tech stack, and it was back in 2022 that we said, if we have to go in the direction of diffusion and global adoption, the only choice we have is the American tech. And we had started those conversations with Microsoft and others way back in 2022. The political narrative got framed in 2023, so they were a year behind. Our focus was getting the work done rather than getting into this whole debate of US-China. And that's the reason why we've got to where we are today, where the technology is advancing, the work is happening, rather than get distracted with the geopolitics of things.
So Parag, I want to come back to you because your other unusual thesis is that this is now the rise of Asia, That again is a lens.
Is it really unusual?
Well, but as you said, the whole world is focused only on US and China most of the time. And when you say Asia, what is that geography? What is included in Asia? And is it that it's the weight of China that's bringing up the Asia story? Or is it like, uniformly diffused? So help us understand your thesis on that, and why do you say that this is structural and it's not a surprise?
Well, for one thing, since you mentioned the geography, no two geographers dispute the definition of Asia. It's only in contemporary, in the media and politics where, depending on where you are in the world, people have a different understanding of Asia. In Asia itself, in East Asia, when people say Asia, they mean East Asia, they mean the Pacific Rim. They literally don't talk about India. They actually exclude India in their mind. But if you're a geographer, there is exactly one definition of Asia, and it stretches all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It includes Turkey, right? It most certainly includes India. It most definitely includes the Gulf, which is known as West Asia. And it includes Russia, which is North Asia.
But Russia
of course,
doesn't see
Europeans think of, or have thought of, and in international organizations like the World Bank or IMF or FIFA, whichever ones Russia is still in and hasn't been kicked out of, it will classify itself or be thought of as European. But of course, that's a cultural, historical thing. But if you look at the economics and the geostrategy of Russia today, it is an Asian country. It has been excluded, in almost every way from Western economies, other than, of course, dark fleets and whatnot. So Asia...
But have you tried telling President Putin that he's Asian?
It's not about telling them, it's how they behave, right? It's not about narratives. Let's be post-ideological. Let's be very brutally material about this. India, China, other countries are the ones buying Russian oil. Their commodities are coming south and east to Asia. All new infrastructure investment into Russia is being made either by Russia or by Asian partners. New population, Russia, you spoke about demographics, which I'm glad you mentioned. Russia has signed a skills transfer partnership with which country to import a couple of million workers? India, right? So let's not be trapped in sort of antiquated mental prisms, right? But remember, Russia can be both. It can be. We'll see what it becomes. That's not the question we're answering. We're saying right now, Russia is very much an Asian strategic appendage, right? So then, is it structural? Of course it's structural. Asia, in the proper geographical understanding, is literally 2/3 of the population of the human species. And it's most of the world's economy. It has all of the land, labor, capital, industry, technology, resources to be quite self-sufficient, which is, to go to your very first question, what is economic security, right? It's to what extent can you have continuity and growth with as little friction and dependency in external supply chains as possible. Asia can be even more self-sufficient. The other part of the world that can be quite self-sufficient and is moving in that direction is, of course, North America. And to be clear, again, as a geographer, you don't speak of America as in only the United States of America. You speak of North America, which is only 3 countries, maybe 4, depending on what happens to Greenland, we'll see. But I personally think Greenland should be independent-ish. I'm going to get a lot of flack from the Danish ambassador now, but I made this argument like 20 years ago. But you have, in effect, a North American Union forming. Now, if I went to President Trump and said, no, don't think of this as a hegemonic, sort of play. Think of this as a, sort of an amicable federation, he might wave it off. But again, I am telling you what is actually happening. The United States trades, despite the animosity between the leaders, the United States trades much more with Canada and much more with Mexico each than it does with China, right? There is an emergent North American federation taking place, even if the leaders are at each other's throats. So it doesn't matter what Putin thinks. It doesn't matter what Trump thinks. Let's look at numbers. Let's look at infrastructure. Let's look at facts on the ground. Let's look at movements of people. And what you will see is this emergent future. And geopolitics deals with those things in a very material way, and in order to paint that picture. But Asia, I believe, just has to do one big thing, which is keep the geoeconomics of convergence. One of the stats that was flashing behind us right now was that China and ASEAN now officially, as of last year, traded about $1 trillion with each other, right? So Asian countries pursuing this geoeconomic convergence while keeping the geopolitical tensions, not least between India and China, for example, Taiwan, Japan, at bay, that's the #1 priority. Asia has done that well for 36 years and counting. We need to keep it that way. It's not going to be America for all of the Nobel Prizes that Trump believes he deserves. It's not going to be his diplomacy that's going to keep Asia peaceful. Ultimately, it is Asians' responsibility. And there, I think, we have to be incredibly vigilant.
So how do you think that this will play out? If, the question that I asked the professor, and I'd like to ask you both, is that given that there is this, let's even say imaginative turmoil, because your point is that all the underlying infrastructure that really makes up the global maps of the world have been in place for a while, and there's nothing really new happening there. But let's just say at the level of imagination, one feels the global order is in a tailspin. How do you see this expressing itself, say, in a short term of the next 10 years?
Global order is this perpetually evolving, creation, of ours. Just because the multilateral system as we knew it in the post-war decades, the past 80 years, is being undermined and eroded. That has been true. Just you can go back to the 1990s and already read books, headline-grabbing books, saying Western powers in particular are undermining the United Nations system, either because they're avoiding the norms through their unsanctioned interventions, and whether it's the Balkans or elsewhere, or because they're not being sufficiently inclusive of rising powers like India and others that should have become members of the UN Security Council. So we've been hearing this for a long time. World order, though, is not one institution. It's the process. There is an emergent trade paradigm of new vectors, of new configurations of relationships and complementarities, even if the World Trade Organization disappeared tomorrow. When was the last time anyone here cared what the UN Security Council ruled on anything when you're not even a member of it? It has no legitimacy. Trump convened a board of peace, right, which was actually authorized by the UN Security Council to do God knows what, whatever it is, it's not going to succeed. But the point is that this is the chaos, and that chaos is out of that chaos springs a certain order. So what do I see in the next 10 years? Lots more of these new coalitions. But don't treat these coalitions as anything less than what we had before. If the United Nations system, if the existing multilateral order of the Bretton Woods institutions had been perfectly effective, then no one would have had the incentive to undermine it and to go do their own thing. It wasn't working for everyone in a democratic, universal way. Only people who are just basically blind to the reality of the past decades. Why did China do Belt and Road? Obviously it did so to export certain surplus production and to ensure that it could have more streamlined access to its major markets and commodities imports. But let's ask yourself, did anyone finance global infrastructure development for the post-colonial world, for the 150 developing countries in the world between 1960 and 2010, for that 50 years? Nobody did. The World Bank didn't do it. The door was wide open for China to do Belt and Road and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and those became a pillar of the world order. So let's not live in this kind of mental model where we have to be nostalgic about the past. View history, view every day as a perpetual competition among models, among institutions, and may the most effective one that delivers real benefits for participants be the one that prevails.
So the other question which has dominated global discourse is the trade weaponization. So does that run counter? There's this sense that every country is now receding. Yeah. Economic security has become sovereign security. It's not interdependence. So do you see that then as a kind of counter to what you're saying?
No, what we're seeing is, again, look at the China-ASEAN trade dynamic. That's, again, $1 trillion a year, right? If you take any pair of regions or sub-regions or states within at least Asia, which is, again, most of the world, right? You see growth in the bilateral trade volumes. Between India and China, it's rising again and so forth. Again, even among hostile states. If you look at the US trade deficit, the most recent numbers show it's ballooning because firms have been front-loading their imports in order to avoid the excessive sanctions. So anytime you try and switch off that sort of spigot, it winds up expanding in another direction. So people have a very a sort of cake is finite approach to these things rather than seeing it expanding, a balloon that when you squeeze it grows elsewhere. So, and that's just one piece of it. Globalization can't be reduced to trade. If you're going to reduce globalization to anything, it should be investment, not trade. Trade follows investment very often. Investment volumes, again, are shifting in whole new patterns that are emerging. Again, look at India's growing investment and trade with West Asian countries, with African countries. Just look at, again, it's always great to make a map and to actually have a cartogram where you show the arrows and the volumes and do it as a time series. That is truth. The truth is that investment volumes, trade volumes, many of the migration flows are up, 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 up. So I'm for strategic resilience. I'm for this, regional centers of gravity that are more that's also a more, by the way, environmentally sustainable world. There isn't really a reason today to have to put oil on tankers and wreck the planet in order to provide energy that could easily be produced locally through alternative renewable sources.
You get oil from Venezuela, bring it to India, refine it, and send it back to America.
Whether we're talking about oil or we're talking about avocados, right? We have the tools to decrease globalization in very healthy ways, and I would be for it. I'm not a globalization maximalist in an ideological way, but I am saying that it's not disappearing. The thing about globalization is really, and the UAE is a great place to see this. The thing about globalization is that people who are naysayers, who say it's switching off, it's collapsing, this is the end of globalization. We heard this after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. We heard this after the financial crisis of 2008. We heard this with Trump and Brexit in 2016. We heard this with COVID, and now we hear it with the US-China trade war. I mean, 5, 6 times in the last 20 years, people have said explicitly, the headlines of every major, particularly Western publication, said this is the end of globalization. It's been wrong 5 times in 20 years. So my message for everyone is please do not lose any sleep at night over the fate of globalization. It will long outlast all of us. Only worry about your place in it. If you are worried that globalization is dead, it's probably because globalization has left you behind and you've got sour grapes.
Right. Okay, unfortunately we have to end soon because we have another session which is time-bound. But Faheem, I wanted both of you to give last thoughts. One on what Professor was saying about China. The UAE deals quite strongly with China. It's an important partner. Were there any surprise insights there for you in what he was saying and about how China sees itself?
Not really. Like how Parag said, it's not a binary relationships when it comes to bilaterals. On things that you agree, you continue to trade, build that on, and on others that you don't, you keep at it and kind of navigate the geopolitics. The one thing that I would add to what Parag said for kind of the next 10 years, over and above investment and trade, I think intelligence is going to be a key component of this whole new equation. And in that, there are a lot of frame biases that are out there that we also need to fix, especially kind of the Oriental world side, because all the LLMs have done is they've scraped from the internet, which has a very large English bias that has come from the West. So what is important is new cultural contexts from Middle East, Asia, India, all these parts need to go in and have a wider aperture of knowledge that never existed. And that's a key part that we all need to work towards to increase trade and bilateral cooperation.
I think that's a great note to end on, this rise of regionalism, and Carney called it the middle powers, that maybe this is the time for middle powers and not like 2 hegemonic or 1 hegemonic power, and it'll make for a much more diverse and stable world rather than the idea that's now on that it's an unstable world. Maybe this will be a more stable world with not anybody being very hegemonic. Thank you, both of you, very much. Thank you for those insights.
Thank you. Thank you so much.